They told me for years there was no money in podcasting. Well, they were all wrong.
So how did you become a fan of baseball? Everyone has that story of, my dad is the one who grew me up to be a Yankee fan in Boston, right? You can imagine how tough that was. So who was the person in your life that made you fall in love with baseball?
Okay, so growing up in Canada, there's not like a huge baseball following, particularly in Winnipeg, where, well, we do have a pro team, but it's in one of the independent leagues, the Winnipeg Gold Eyes. Shout out to the Goldies. But I didn't grow up watching them. I guess like by default, the Blue Jays were kind of my team, but much like a lot of Canada, we kind of just we clued in during the playoffs, if there were playoffs for the Blue Jays or the Expos. But the Blue Jays, when they went on that back-to-back World Series run, was when I kind of like first started to actually care a little bit about baseball. But then honestly, it was fantasy baseball that got me. It was my gateway into being interested in baseball.
Oh, that's awesome. It was Joe Carter, right? Hit the walk-off home run.
Yes.
92. Yep.
That one, I believe, was 93.
93.
If I'm not mistaken. Yeah.
I was close. I'll never forget. I wasn't alive.
92, 93. Yeah.
I wasn't alive in 93, but I've seen that home run so many times. And I was like, man, that's the childhood dream. So interesting. Fantasy baseball got you into baseball.
Yep. So, and actually, like, I only did 1 year of fantasy in Canada, and then I moved out to Japan, and it was another Canadian that was living in Okinawa, of all places, where there is no pro baseball, even in Japan. But he was doing MLB fantasy baseball, and he said, "Hey, Trevor, you got to join me in this." And I said, "I don't even know baseball. Like, I don't know any of these guys." And he said, "Okay, I'll give you like a 4-month buffer where I'll give you advice on who to pick up, who to drop, all that kind of stuff. And after that, you're on your own." I got hooked, man. I just loved playing fantasy baseball, and I did it for like at least a decade after that, maybe even more.
Well, fantasy baseball, okay, this is a little bit of a sidebar too. Fantasy baseball is literally like the reason why like DraftKings is even a company to begin with. Like how sports gambling is so big in this country. And let me explain. Have you ever seen the ESPN 30 for 30 on fantasy baseball? It's like one of the first 30 for 30s they ever did.
I haven't seen that one, no.
So find it. It's incredible because it tells a story about how these 4 nerds just literally did fantasy baseball like by hand, all the stats, the point systems. Now you go on to Yahoo or ESPN, it's easy. They did it by hands, and it really took off because they put money on it. Right. And then that turned to fantasy football, that turned to fantasy basketball, and then fantasy football turned into like, oh, DraftKings, like, oh, you can just put bets on what's going to happen. And then you'll pick teams, parlays, all this stuff. So yeah, fantasy baseball. I love that you got into baseball through fantasy baseball because I really followed baseball really heavily in middle school through fantasy baseball. Like, I've been a Yankee fan my whole life, big baseball fan my whole life, but fantasy baseball was also something for me that kind of took it to the next level. It let me know who these like B-list players on other teams were because you pick them up for a week in fantasy because they're going 4 for 10 in like in the past 2 games. So that's crazy. What was fantasy baseball like when you started? Was it on a computer or was it kind of like old school?
Yeah, my very first one, like in Canada, before I got into it over in Japan, was it was on paper. So it was pre-internet or right in the infancy of internet. And so I don't even know if there was a good fantasy baseball option on the net. But then when I got to Okinawa, I think it was the year 2000 was my first kind of foray into fantasy baseball again. And that one was Yahoo. So I just stuck with Yahoo for pretty much like from then until I think 2015 was the last year that I did it.
Yeah, Yahoo's great. I like Yahoo fantasy baseball. I haven't done it. I've done it since high school. It's hard to get a group of people nowadays, especially amongst my friends. All my friends hate baseball. So it's just like me and like 3 other guys. So it's like we can't really form a league around that. I don't want to do it with randos. But fantasy football every year, $100. Here you go. I'm gonna lose. But whatever.